My name is Daniel Miller, and until last summer, I thought I had landed in the American dream. A quiet cul-de-sac in a Midwestern suburb. White picket fences, neighbors who waved when you walked the dog, lawn mowers humming on Saturday mornings like some synchronized choir of normalcy. It was peaceful, predictable, the kind of place where the biggest drama was whether Karen at number 12 had used too much fertilizer and killed her begonias. That was before she arrived. That was before I learned that neighbor revenge is not a Reddit fantasy, but a survival tactic. Her name was Brenda. She pulled in with a rusty minivan one Friday afternoon, two kids hanging out the side windows like circus animals, already shrieking before they even set foot on the grass. She had the look of someone who believed rules were optional, a cigarette dangling from her mouth, a t-shirt that said, "Good vibes only," as if it were a personal challenge to the universe. By midnight, the first crack appeared in my suburban bubble. 4 o'clock in the morning, I was yanked out of a dream about grilling steaks by the sound of children screaming. Not crying, not whimpering, but full-throated howls, like hyenas tearing into a carcass. The walls of my house trembled. My dog hid under the bed. I stumbled outside in my bathrobe, convinced some emergency was unfolding. There was no emergency. There were just Brenda's kids, running laps around their living room, pounding on the floor, shrieking like banshees while a television blasted cartoons at maximum volume. Brenda was nowhere in sight, or maybe she was sitting on the couch, with the glazed eyes of someone who had long since stopped acknowledging reality. That was night one. By the end of week one, I was learning the new rhythm of my life. Kids at 4 a.m., music at noon. Brenda had an old speaker system that could probably rattle the bones of the dead, and she loved to use it at the precise hour when the rest of us were trying to work from home, attend Zoom meetings, or just exist without feeling our teeth buzz. Noon became my personal midnight. Bass notes shook my coffee mug across the table. My boss asked if I was working from a nightclub. My wife started spending her afternoons at the library just to escape. And me? I sat in the living room, eyes twitching, watching the blinds shiver with each drop of bass, wondering if the CIA had secretly chosen Brenda as part of an experimental torture program. Sleep deprivation plus sonic assault. Was this not what they did at Guantanamo? I tried to reason with her. I walked over one afternoon, knocked politely, and when she opened the door, I was nearly knocked backward by a wave of cigarette smoke and bubblegum-scented chaos. "Hey," I said, forcing a smile. "I was wondering if you could maybe keep the music down a little around noon. I work nights sometimes and—" She cut me off with a laugh that sounded like gravel rolling down a hill. "This is my house. My kids need to blow off steam. If you cannot handle it, maybe you picked the wrong neighborhood." Then she shut the door in my face. I stood there blinking, like a fool, with the sudden realization that I had stepped into a parallel universe where common courtesy had been outlawed. From then on, it escalated. The screams got louder, the music heavier, and Brenda seemed to develop a sixth sense for when I most needed silence. Important conference call, cue the shrieking children. Sunday nap, here comes the subwoofer. I started imagining her as part of some underground experiment, like she had been planted in my life to see how long it would take for a normal man to snap. Maybe the homeowners association was testing my patience, or maybe the government was using her to measure suburban stress levels. The thought was ridiculous, but when you are awake at 4 a.m., listening to children sound like possessed demons, conspiracy theories stop sounding crazy and start sounding like explanations. My wife, Rebecca, told me I was overreacting. "They are just kids," she said, sipping her tea, as though tea could protect her from the psychological warfare next door. But Rebecca was not the one whose home office faced their living room wall. She was not the one who watched her calendar fill with red-eyed apologies to coworkers. She was not the one who lay awake at dawn listening to the pounding feet of children who had clearly been possessed by the ghost of a marching band. The line between irritation and madness is thinner than people realize. I could feel myself inching across it. One night, lying awake with my dog shivering beside me, I thought I heard something under the noise. Beneath the shrieks and the thuds and the endless cartoons, there was a hum, low and steady, like machinery. It pulsed in rhythm with the children's screams. I sat up, convinced that Brenda's house was not a house at all, but some kind of transmitter. What if those screams were being recorded and beamed into space? What if Brenda was not a negligent parent, but a handler for some intergalactic experiment in psychological warfare? My rational brain laughed at the thought, but my sleep-starved brain whispered, "What if you are right?" The neighbors began to notice too. Old Mr. Jenkins from 2 doors down started complaining about migraines. Sarah, who lived across the street, said her toddler had started waking up screaming at the same times Brenda's kids screamed. Coincidence? Or evidence that Brenda was conducting acoustic terrorism? We began trading stories over fences, each of us convinced we were victims of some larger plot. Maybe she was testing a new form of crowd control. Maybe she was summoning demons with bass frequencies. Or maybe, simplest of all, she was just the worst neighbor in America. But here is the thing. In America, we are trained to smile through the pain. We bake pies for block parties, we wave while mowing lawns, and we pretend everything is fine, even when it is not. So we all smiled at Brenda in daylight, pretending we were not plotting her downfall in the shadows. I started keeping a notebook, documenting every incident with timestamps and descriptions, not just for the police but for posterity. 4:03 a.m., child screaming, sounds like Banshee audition. 12:15 p. Bass drops, window panes rattling, possible earthquake. The notebook grew thick, my handwriting grew jagged. It was no longer a diary. It was evidence, proof that I was not insane, that something sinister was truly happening on our quiet cul-de-sac. And yet, despite the evidence, no authority seemed to care. The police shrugged. The HOA mumbled about bylaws but did nothing. Even the city's noise complaint hotline treated me like an inconvenience. It was then that I realized the truth. No one was coming to save me. If I wanted peace, I would have to claim it myself. I would have to enter the world of neighbor revenge. Sleep deprivation is a strange drug. It does not make you hallucinate in the psychedelic sense, but it does peel back the thin film of civility that holds you together. By the end of month 2, I had become something between a mad scientist and a conspiracy theorist living in my own basement. Rebecca tried to stage an intervention. "Daniel," she said one morning, her eyes heavy with her own lack of sleep, "you cannot keep obsessing over Brenda. File the complaints and let it go." But she did not hear the hidden codes in the noise. I did. On night 47 of the torture cycle, at exactly 4:07 a.m., both children screamed in perfect unison, a pitch so steady and so high that my wine glasses rattled in the cabinet. I swear on my father's grave, it was a single musical note held for 38 seconds. That was not coincidence. That was performance. That was training. And in that moment, I realized Brenda was weaponizing her children. Whether knowingly or not, she was teaching them to harmonize at a frequency that cracked the sanity of her neighbors. She was not just a bad mother, she was a conductor of chaos. I tried all the respectable channels first, because that is what Americans are told to do. I filed complaints with the police department. An officer came by once, listened for 3 minutes, shrugged, and told me, "Kids will be kids." I contacted the homeowners association, but the board president's nephew happened to be dating Brenda, and suddenly my emails stopped being returned. I even wrote a letter to the city council. They filed it under Noise Ordinance Backlog. Meanwhile, Brenda turned her noon ritual into a carnival. She opened her windows wide, blasted electronic dance music at levels that could sterilize a garden, and sometimes even danced on her porch in broad daylight, daring anyone to stop her. That was when the neighbors started cracking. Old Mr. Jenkins stopped walking his dog. Sarah's toddler developed night terrors. A UPS driver refused to deliver packages to Brenda's house because, as he told me in hushed tones, the walls vibrate like it is alive. Each of us was being reshaped by the sonic landscape, but instead of uniting us, the neighborhood fragmented. Some retreated into denial, some lashed out at me as though I was exaggerating. And then there were whispers. Maybe Brenda had dirt on the HOA. Maybe she was connected to someone in the city hall. One night at the local bar, I overheard 2 men arguing about whether Brenda's kids were even human. "No normal lungs can scream that long," one insisted. The other nodded gravely. I drank my beer and pretended not to agree. Then came the driveway incident. It was a Saturday, a deceptively sunny afternoon. Rebecca and I were grilling burgers in the backyard, trying to simulate normal life. Suddenly, Brenda rolled out an ancient SUV, parked it at the edge of her driveway, and opened all 4 doors. Out came the bass, a tidal wave of sound that flattened the grass, shook the ketchup bottle off our table, and sent the dog yelping inside. I swear the sun dimmed. I ran to the fence and shouted, "Turn it down!" She raised her beer in salute, smirked, and turned it up. That was the first time I felt my vision narrow into tunnel focus. It was not just anger, it was clarity. If this was a chess game, Brenda had just moved her queen into the open. I finally knew the rules. There were none. My health began to fail. I started showing up late to work, and my boss gave me looks that said promotion season was not going my way. My hands shook when I typed. I caught myself dozing off at stoplights. At home, Rebecca and I fought more than we talked. One night, she slammed the bedroom door and shouted, "You care more about Brenda than about me." I wanted to argue, but she was right. Brenda had taken over not just my neighborhood, but my marriage, my sanity, my very identity. I was not Daniel Miller anymore. I was the guy next to Brenda. The real breaking point came on what I call the night of the sirens. It was 2 a.m, and the kids had been at it for hours, running, pounding, shrieking. Suddenly, the music kicked on, heavy industrial bass, louder than ever before. It was so loud the smoke detectors in my house went off. I grabbed my phone and called the police again, screaming into the receiver. This time, 2 cruisers pulled up, lights flashing red and blue against our perfect suburban homes. For a brief shining moment, I believed salvation had arrived. But when the officers knocked on Brenda's door, she stepped out in a bathrobe, smiled sweetly, and said, "Oh, the kids just had a nightmare. The music must have been a glitch." And just like that, they left. As they drove away, Brenda turned toward me. Her smile sharpened into something I can only describe as reptilian. She knew she was untouchable. That night, I sat in my darkened living room, staring at my reflection in the window. My eyes were bloodshot, my hair unwashed, my skin pale. I realized Brenda had done what even the military could not. She had broken me without laying a hand on me. I felt like a prisoner of war in my own house. My notebook of complaints lay open on the coffee table, dozens of pages filled with timestamps and frantic notes. It looked less like a record of truth and more like the diary of a madman. And maybe that was what I had become. I started fantasizing, not just about silence, but about revenge. At first it was harmless, egging her house, calling Child Protective Services, slipping a strongly worded letter into her mailbox. But the fantasies grew. What if I installed subwoofers of my own, broadcasting ultrasonic frequencies only dogs and children could hear? What if I hacked her Wi-Fi and filled her speakers with Gregorian chants at 4 a.m? What if I called every telemarketer in America and gave them her number? Neighbor revenge was no longer a joke. It was a survival plan. Rebecca caught me one night sketching out blueprints for a homemade sonic equalizer built from thrift store speakers and a secondhand generator. "Daniel," she whispered, horrified, "you are scaring me." But I could not stop. I had crossed the threshold. I was no longer waiting for someone else to solve my problem. I was preparing for war. When dawn came, I looked at my neighborhood differently. The white picket fences were not decorations anymore. They were borders. The neatly trimmed lawns were not innocent, but potential battlegrounds. Brenda had turned our cul-de-sac into a war zone, and I was done being a civilian. The next move would be mine. The morning after the night of the sirens, I did not feel like a broken man anymore. I felt like a general sketching maps before battle. Rebecca had left for her sister's house, muttering something about needing a break from the madness. Maybe she was right. Maybe I had slipped into obsession. But as I sat at my kitchen table staring at my overflowing notebook of timestamps and decibel measurements, something clicked. Brenda was not just noise. Brenda was a system. And systems, no matter how chaotic they seem, can be hacked. The first step was reconnaissance. I watched her house like an amateur spy. Through the blinds, I timed her smoke breaks, her kids' meltdowns, even the exact minute when the bass usually kicked in. Noon was sacred to her, like a ritual. Sometimes she would even raise her arms on the porch, swaying as though calling on some pagan god of sound. I drew diagrams. Noon was her high tide. 4 a.m. was her moonrise. I began to think of her house as a temple of noise, with its own rhythms and sacred hours. If she could weaponize her chaos, then I would weaponize my order. Step 2 was procurement. I prowled Craigslist like a scavenger. Old stereo systems, broken amplifiers, discarded subwoofers. People practically gave them away. By the end of the week, my garage looked like the backstage of a failed rock concert. I taught myself about frequencies on YouTube. Brown noise, pink noise, ultrasonic hums. Did you know that certain frequencies can make people nauseous, even paranoid? I did not, until one particularly sleepless night when a former Navy sonar technician in Kansas explained it in a video titled, "The Sound of Madness." I clicked subscribe. Step 3 was testing. At first, I went small, a portable speaker pressed against the shared fence, looping whale calls at random hours. The children stopped shrieking mid-run, cocked their heads, and went silent. Victory. Next, I tried something more ambitious. A low-frequency pulse played through a salvaged subwoofer at exactly 3:59 a.m., 1 minute before the kids' usual screaming marathon. That night, they never woke. Either I had jammed their internal demon alarm clock, or I had accidentally lulled them into dreamland. Whatever it was, it worked. For the first time in months, I slept. But sleep is addictive, and revenge more so. Soon I was designing full campaigns. I rigged my sprinkler system with motion sensors, timed so that whenever Brenda stepped out for her noon cigarette, she was baptized in cold water. I installed a set of floodlights that blazed like interrogation lamps whenever her kids darted too close to my driveway. I even bought a flock of plastic pink flamingos and planted them in my yard facing her windows, each with reflective tape on its beak. By day, they were kitschy ornaments. By night, when the street lamps hit them, they glowed like a silent army, watching her every move. The neighborhood began to notice. Sarah whispered that she had seen lights flashing in Brenda's windows at odd hours, like alien signals. Jenkins muttered about the hum that kept him awake, even though it seemed to come from nowhere. Soon, rumors spread that Brenda's house was haunted. Delivery drivers left packages at the curb and sprinted away. For the first time, Brenda looked uneasy. She still blasted her music, but I saw her glance nervously at the blinds, as if she felt the invisible pressure building. And yet, here is where it gets strange. The deeper I sank into revenge, the more I began to feel, almost sympathetic. Watching Brenda pace her porch at night, cigarette trembling in her fingers, I wondered if she was really a villain, or just another casualty of some larger machine. Maybe she was broke, raising 2 kids alone, clinging to noise because silence meant facing her failures. Maybe the base was not defiance, but anesthesia. The thought unsettled me. Could I hate someone and pity them at the same time? Apparently, yes. That is the American way, but sympathy did not erase the damage. My marriage was cracked, my job hanging by a thread, my sanity duct taped together. This was not about forgiveness. This was about reclaiming my home. So I escalated. I built what I called the equalizer, a Frankenstein tower of speakers wired into a timer, set to unleash carefully chosen frequencies at unpredictable hours. Not loud enough to break laws, but insistent, invasive, like an itch you cannot scratch. I disguised it as a tool cabinet in the garage, wires running discreetly under the fence. I felt like some Cold War operative, except my battlefield was vinyl siding and garden gnomes. When the equalizer went live, the results were immediate. The kids stopped running. Brenda started snapping at neighbors in the street. Twice, I heard her yelling at her own walls as though they were betraying her. One afternoon, she stormed into the middle of the cul-de-sac and shouted, "This whole street is against me!" No one responded. The silence was delicious. For once, I was not the crazy one. She was. But power is a dangerous thing. The more Brenda unraveled, the more the neighbors began to look at me differently. They nodded approvingly, dropped hints that they liked the new quiet, even though none of them asked how it had come about. It was an unspoken pact. They suspected I had something to do with it, but as long as Brenda was suffering, no one would tattle. Neighbor revenge had become neighborhood revenge, and I was the accidental general. Still, I knew it could not last forever. Systems collapse, retaliation comes. And sure enough, one Saturday at high noon, Brenda unleashed her counterstrike. She dragged her speakers onto the porch, plugged them into a generator, and blasted music so loud that the air itself seemed to ripple. Windows shook. Birds fled. A car alarm wailed 2 blocks away. She stood on the porch like a victorious tyrant, her kids dancing around her, flipping off the neighborhood. It was not music anymore. It was war drums. But here is the twist. Instead of fury, I felt calm, because I was ready. The equalizer was humming in my garage, waiting for my command. The sprinklers were loaded. The floodlights were armed. My notebook lay open on the table, filled with strategies. Brenda thought she was untouchable, but she had underestimated one thing. When you torture a man long enough, you do not just create a victim, you create an inventor. And inventors in America always fight back. That night, as the bass still echoed in my bones, I whispered to myself a single promise. The endgame was coming, and when it did, silence would not just be golden. It would be my masterpiece. The night Brenda turned her porch into a rave, I realized this was no longer about noise. It was about dominance. She wanted the whole cul-de-sac to know that she could bend reality to her will. And maybe for a moment she succeeded. Neighbors shut their blinds, retreated indoors, hid like villagers when a dragon swoops overhead. But dragons have weaknesses. And that night, staring out my window at her makeshift stage, I decided I would be the one to find them. The equalizer was humming in my garage, but I did not unleash it yet. Revenge, real revenge, is not about a single blow. It is about theater. It is about timing. Americans do not just want justice. We want spectacle. We want fireworks on the 4th of July, touchdowns in the final seconds, courtroom dramas with surprise witnesses. I was not going to fight Brenda with brute force. I was going to choreograph her downfall. Step 1 was patience. I let her keep playing Queen of Noise for another week. The kids screamed at 4 a.m., the music blared at noon, and I endured it, notebook in hand. But while she thought I was breaking again, I was assembling my evidence like a prosecutor preparing for trial. Decibel readings, video clips from security cameras, statements from neighbors who, for the first time, were ready to put their complaints in writing. Even Jenkins, who had once accused me of exaggerating, signed his name on a formal letter. When the stack was thick enough to look intimidating, I mailed copies to the police department, the HOA, and the city council, with one line scrawled across the cover. This is not a neighborhood, this is torture. Step 2 was the performance. I waited until a Saturday, when the street was alive with lawnmowers and barbecue smoke. I rolled my garage door open, revealing the Frankenstein tower of the equalizer, wires glowing like veins, speakers stacked like artillery. The neighbors gathered, pretending to make small talk but really watching me. Brenda stepped onto her porch, cigarette dangling, music already thumping. I raised a beer in salute. She narrowed her eyes. For the first time, she looked unsure. At exactly 11:59 a.m., I flipped the switch. The equalizer roared to life, not with music, but with a hum so low it seemed to come from the bones of the earth. Windows rattled, but not violently, just enough to remind everyone that sound could be an invisible fist. Brenda's kids froze mid-scream, staring at the walls as if they were whispering secrets. Brenda rushed inside, then stumbled back out, shouting, "What the hell are you doing?" I smiled and said, "Keeping up with the neighborhood." The neighbors laughed, a sound more devastating than any bass drop. For the first time, the street was not afraid of Brenda. They were laughing at her. She retaliated, of course. She cranked her speakers, dragged them into the yard, dared me to outblast her. But here is the thing. I did not. I simply turned the equalizer down to a barely audible hum, then sat in a lawn chair sipping my beer, unmoved. She looked ridiculous, a woman screaming into the void, her music blaring into a cul-de-sac that refused to dance. Her power was crumbling, not because of my machine, but because the social fabric had finally turned against her. America does not forgive tyrants, even suburban ones. We tolerate them, we fear them, but when the moment comes, we delight in watching them fall. Within days, the real consequences arrived. A police officer knocked on her door with a noise violation ticket, 500, thanks to the decibel logs I had submitted. The HOA sent her a formal warning, threatening fines and even eviction proceedings. Delivery services stopped dropping packages at her door, citing unsafe environment. Her temple of noise was collapsing, brick by brick. And then something unexpected happened. I saw her on the porch one evening, no cigarette, no music, just her and the kids sitting quietly. She looked small, deflated, human. For a moment, I felt a flicker of guilt. Maybe I had gone too far. Maybe I had become the monster I was fighting. Rebecca, who had returned home after hearing of my victory, put her hand on my shoulder and said, "Do you feel better now?" I wanted to say yes, but the truth is, revenge does not feel like victory. It feels like survival. The kids still scream sometimes. Not as often, not as loud, but enough to remind me they are children, not soldiers in some intergalactic experiment. Brenda still plays music, but at normal human levels. And the cul-de-sac has returned to its old rhythm. Lawnmowers, barbecues, polite waves. Yet nothing is the same, because now, whenever neighbors see me walking the dog, they nod with a new kind of respect. Not fear, not pity, respect. I am no longer just Daniel Miller. I am Daniel Miller, the man who tamed Brenda. The man who proved that neighbor revenge is not just a fantasy, it is a weapon. And maybe, just maybe, I went too far. Sometimes late at night, when the house is quiet, I think I hear a faint hum in the walls, even though the equalizer is unplugged. Maybe it is my imagination, or maybe revenge has a way of echoing long after the battle is won. Either way, I sit on my porch, beer in hand, listening to the silence I created. And I whisper to myself the line I have earned: silence, the sweetest revenge.